Welcome to Political Perspectives, and once again we come back to you after a week in which there have been enormous developments in the presidential race in particular. We've seen a motivated Republican convention officially nominate former President Trump as its leader, and Vice President nominee is J.D. Vance. President Biden has been forced out of the race by his own party. President Obama, in not endorsing Kamala Harris at first, but in praising Biden, talked about a process for choosing the next leader of the party. That process lasted only 48 hours because Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader, came out and said the process is over, it's all been decided. Kamala Harris appears to have the nomination locked up. Joining me again to discuss these matters is the chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, Byron York. And Byron, do voters have any reason to believe that the Democrats really care about democracy in general? They say that they are the savior of democracy, or indeed, do they care about what voters think about who should the leader should be or the policies that should be adopted?
Well, I hear him talking about democracy all the time. And this has been an absolute incredible period of time. As we speak, 7 days ago, the president, who we all know is aged and infirm, tested positive for COVID and went into isolation. And while in isolation, he was forced by a group of Democratic insiders to withdraw from the presidential race. He then quickly gave his endorsement to Kamala Harris, and the party stampeded. I don't think there's any other word, just stampeded to Harris. And within about 30 to 32 hours, she had the nomination. She had a majority of endorsements from Democrats in the House of Representatives, a majority in the Senate, all of the state chairs, and then she had a majority of the nearly 4,000 delegates to the Democratic National Convention. So it was an absolutely mind-boggling, head-turning process. And there was zero transparency. If you remember, a week or so ago, before Biden had actually withdrawn, there were Democrats talking about something like a mini primary. How could they arrange some contests where Democratic voters could look at some of the possible candidates, among them Kamala Harris, or maybe Gretchen Whitmer, or maybe Josh Shapiro, or maybe Gavin Newsom, a number of prominent Democrats, to decide who they think would be best. Well, that just went completely out the window in this race to embrace Kamala Harris. And it's all completely without transparency. We're going to have to try to find out what happened behind these closed doors.
Yeah. You know, one guess for me is that there were a lot of people who regard themselves as national candidates or future national candidates for the Democratic Party, whether that's Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, those sorts of people, for whom the idea of joining the 2028 race 100 days or so before the actual election just looks like something to avoid like the plague. Donald Trump has been leading in the polls. The party that they would be leading is a total mess. So there are a lot of people who perhaps also look at the way that Governor Ron DeSantis entered the Republican Party primaries when people thought that Trump was going to win it, and he damaged his career really substantially. So I imagine that one of the reasons why Kamala Harris, after just 48 hours, has had a stampede of support is that no one else wants to be on the ticket. No one else wants to be the nominee this time around. So here we are with Kamala Harris, and I'd like you to take a look at a clip of one of her first public appearances as the presumptive nominee, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. I'll get your reaction to it.
California, and before that I was a courtroom prosecutor. In those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
So there she was talking to a crowd, and she was emphasizing her background as a prosecutor, which is something which over the course of the last several years she has actually sought to bury. And she was talking about knowing the character of fraudsters, of sex abusers, and making the connection with President Trump, former President Trump, explicit, saying she knows his type. This is pretty revealing about the campaign that she's going to run, isn't it?
I think it is. I mean, you look at that and you say, well, that's why this lawfare campaign happened. I mean, that's why we saw the lawsuits and criminal cases against President Trump, former President Trump, so that the Democratic candidate could use them in the campaign. And in the clip, Kamala Harris specifically referenced the 3 cases against Trump that have been adjudicated, all of them in New York. The E. Jean Carroll lawsuit against Trump, that's the sexual abuse lawsuit. The State Attorney General Letitia James lawsuit against Trump, that's the business fraud lawsuit. And then the Alvin Bragg indictment of Trump, in which Trump was found guilty on 34 felony counts. That's another business fraud case. All of them deeply, deeply flawed cases, but there they are. They got judges, they got juries, they got verdicts. And that is why this was done, so that it could damage Trump in the election. Now, whether it actually will, we don't know. But clearly, Kamala Harris, in her very first appearance as presumptive nominee, made a big deal about it. So I think it's going to be a big deal in the campaign.
Yeah, it's like a keynote for the campaign. And the flip side of that keynote is that she is going to try and bury her extreme left-wing past. I mean, she was perhaps the most left-wing voter in the Senate. She supported the Green New Deal, called for the ban on fracking, an end to offshore energy exploration. She actually tweeted out a way for people to send money to the George Floyd rioters. In all sorts of ways, she's been a left-wing candidate. And of course, she was in charge of the border of illegal immigration and trying to stem that flow. And now suddenly she's running away from all of that, and she's getting great help from the media, as you'd expect, with CNN correcting the idea and Axios correcting the idea that she was the border czar, an area where she categorically failed for the last several years. What you see is her running away from her record, the media helping her run away from the record, and she wants to bolster the idea of herself as being the antagonist and the prosecutor against Trump.
Well, the media swoon has been pretty impressive. I mean, now this is just my impression, but it appeared after Harris became very, very quickly the presumptive nominee, a giant sense of relief came over so many people that you see on television, that they no longer had to be talking about Joe Biden's infirmities, and now they could all get behind Kamala Harris and talk about how great she was, and the Beyonce song and all of this wonderful stuff. They're very, very excited about it. As far as Biden's record, I'm sorry, but she owns it. I mean, she is his vice president, and she supported everything that he did. The border czar is kind of a funny situation, because there was some confusion about whether she was sort of the overall border czar or whether she was the root causes border czar. We know specifically that the president put her in charge of going down to the Northern Triangle countries. This is classic Democratic liberalism. And to work on the root causes that cause people to leave, Honduras or El Salvador or Nicaragua, and then travel up to the United States. Not actually stop them at the border and enforce the laws of the United States, but work on the root causes in those countries. Obviously, she failed enormously. And also, it was kind of old thinking, because so many people crossing the border are now coming from Venezuela, China, India, Africa, all over the world. So we don't just have the Northern Triangle to worry about. But she owns the record, and I just don't think there's any way that she'll be able to get away from it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would say the root cause of people arriving is because President Biden and Kamala Harris encouraged them to come.
Excellent point.
So I think that the fact that she's running away from her record and she's focusing on there's a fundamental problem that she has, and that is up until now, and presumably into the last 100 days of the campaign, the Democratic strategy is to try and get voters to focus entirely on Donald Trump, on what they claim as his threat to democracy, on his criminal record, the felony convictions, etc. They wanted to make this a referendum on Trump. They didn't want to focus on Biden. They don't really want to focus on Kamala Harris. But that's going to be extremely difficult because although she is, well, to the extent that she is known at all, she is not very popular. She is not nearly as well known either as Trump or as Biden was. And she has to use this final 100 days of the campaign to present herself to the public. So she will inevitably be the center of attention and the focus will be on her policies. So I think there's a fundamental flaw in the campaign that she is intending to mount. Do you not?
I actually agree with that. You know, we had talked in the past about the absolutely historic nature of the presidential race in the sense that you had two people running against each other who've both been president of the United States. Has not been seen in anybody's living memory. Well, that's out the window now. And it's Kamala Harris, who has not been president of the United States, running against Donald Trump, who has. And I personally think there's a stature gap between anybody who's been president and anybody else who hasn't. I think you certainly saw that in the Republican race. And I think you'll even see that in this race. But there was a moment in her Milwaukee speech, her first speech as candidate, that Harris said she'd be happy to put her record up against Donald Trump's anytime. And I think the Trump campaign is going to jump at that and try to present that at every opportunity. And because Trump was president, we're not talking about promises. We're talking about actually what he did. I think they'll have a pretty strong case.
Yeah. Well, it's going to take at least a few days before pollsters discover which way things seem to be moving. As you've said in the past, we need to wait because these things need a week or two to really begin to where you can discern their shape. That we're going to leave it there for the moment, Byron, and we'll come back and look at this all of this stuff again in a week's time. Thank you very much for being with us, and I want to thank everybody for joining us on Political Perspectives. Do join us again next time.